Redditors who witnessed a murder. What's your story? Used to work at a movie theater. I would change the sign near the road in the middle of the night. I saw a taxi pull up to a bus stop. It stayed there for quite some time. That's what caught my attention. How long it was there for. Saw a dude get out and quickly walk away. A week later I was changing the sign again, and I hear a voice below asking me to come down. After he showed me his badge, I obliged, and he asked if I'd seen anything weird the week before. I replied only that a taxi had sat there for a while and a guy got out. I had to then go look at a ton of mugshots. Turns out I was the sole witness to some poor bastard's murder without even realizing it. Wish I had a better look at the guy so I could get some justice. Story 2. I saw a few in Mexico. The most memorable one was the first one I saw while I lived there. I was cleaning out a house with some buddies of mine. A guy was walking down the block. We heard gunshots. I looked out the window and there was that same guy laying out on the sidewalk. A black pickup truck sped by. I think there were 4 guys on back, all with bandanas covering their faces, all with guns in their hands. The thing that stuck with me is they all looked younger than me. I was 22 at the time. According to the paper that was released, he was from out of town and likely they mistook him as someone else. He was 17. His blood was left on the street for days. One of my friends said he heard 14 shots, but I only heard 6. I have the whole experience written down as it was just so foreign to me. This was in Altamirano. I used to stay up late at night trying to think of what kind of life would lead those guys to do a drive-by like that. I also wonder about that 17-year-old. I'm sure he had family visiting there. Story 13. When I was like 13 years old before the drug violence of the 2010s, I was living in a border state of Mexico. One day I went with some friends to the park to play soccer. On our way back to my house, a Lincoln car stopped almost next to us. 2 guys got out of the car, and they also take a dead guy out and put him really close to us. This guy was a drug lord. I remember being in shock and curious. The dead man had all his jewelry on him. I remember seeing his gold Rolex full of diamonds. We didn't walk away, and people started to stop to see the body. Some adults asked us to leave the scene. We walked a few meters and another truck came. Some guys with guns got out and picked up the body. Later, we saw in the news the body was thrown in another place of the city. This was shocking to me because I was young and naive. Another case I remember was a few years ago. I got out of my house in the morning to go for work. When I was a few meters away from my house, I saw the body of a guy, but it had no head. The cartel had decapitated him. The head was left like 3 blocks away from my house. I called the army and the Marines. From what I heard, the rumors said that it was a message to a drug lord living 2 blocks from my house, because this guy worked for him as a messenger. Both cases happened in the nicest and wealthiest part of the city, so if this kind of crime happened in the safest part of the city, I can't imagine what kind of crimes the worst part of the city would have. Story 4. Saw my neighbor murdered in cold blood in my own driveway. My neighbor was helping his lady friend escape a very abusive relationship. Lady's ex hunted her down like a dog. Saw my neighbor walking back home with her after they went to get food for his kids. Heard 3 loud pops. I ran outside to find her screaming, and him blown out of his shoes and into my driveway. He had a hole in his chest big enough to put my fist in. There was nothing I could do to save him except sit with him and hold his hand while I prayed for him to pass quickly. I'll never forget that night. 48 hours later, I broke the lease on my house and moved in with my boyfriend who lives in a much safer borough. You were an awesome neighbor and a wonderful father, Kane. You are certainly missed. What an absolutely disgusting and terrifying human to do something like this. You abuse your partner, they leave you, and then you find them and shoot whoever they're with. And if he was waiting for him, that was premeditated. I don't know if there's enough therapy in the world to fix something like that. Rest in peace, Kane. Story 5. Was walking home one day and saw a couple arguing. The dude started walking off away from the girlfriend's car, and apparently she wasn't happy with that. She proceeded to get in the car and wait about 5 minutes till he was way off down the sidewalk. I was walking on the opposite side of the road as him, and all of a sudden, I see a blur, and he goes flying like a rocket. She must have been going at least 60 miles per hour. He flew through the air and hit a tree, died instantly. The woman then screamed out the window at his body and drove away. There was blood smeared all over the crumpled hood, and I'll never forget the sight of his contorted body at the base of the tree, almost folded in half. I had to talk to the police, and within the hour they caught her at a car wash, trying to clean the blood and chunks off the hood and grill of her car. I was 16 at the time. I actually did have to see a therapist for a few months after. I'm doing very well now, though. However, I don't think I'll fully fully get over it. It's one of those things that always sticks with you. Story 6. Obviously a lot of lead up to the story, but I'm not going there. My girlfriend was taking her dog for a walk while I showered for work. I'm in the bathroom when I hear voices coming from outside. I look out the window and to my horror, my girlfriend is talking to her abusive stepfather, who's standing about 5 feet away from her. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew it wasn't good. Stepfather raises his shotgun, shoots my girlfriend in the face, then shoves the shotgun under his chin and pulls the trigger. Murder into taking his own life. Life's never been the same for me since. Story 7. I was around 8 to 9 years old, and we were vacationing in a vacation village. While we were doing checkout with my family, my father was at the desk while we were waiting at the lobby couches. An argument broke out between two guys who were at the lobby bar. I actually don't know what it was about because it was in another language. One of the guys grabbed a bottle, smashed it, and attacked the other one, hit him in the neck. That guy fell on the floor and there was blood all over the place. My mother closed my eyes after that and took us out, while other people got involved. Years later, I learned that guy lost his life. Story 8. I was 16 driving down the highway in the passenger seat of my mom's car. About 3:30 p.m. Traffic came to a complete halt and we were in the right-hand lane. So as we're creeping along, a semi-truck appears on the shoulder of the highway, door swung wide open. As we move past, there's a trail of blood down the doorstep onto the concrete, and then leading about 20 feet further down the road. As we crept further, the trail of blood ended with a man lying face up, completely covered in blood. There were no police or ambulances there yet. This was on a highway in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area in the US, so plenty of people saw before the scene was taken a hold of by the emergency services. Turns out the truck driver had a partner with him. They got into an argument and the passenger stabbed the driver like a dozen times, then escaped. The murderer was caught about an hour and a half away. One stayed over 2 days later. I have to imagine that I was about 5 minutes behind the truck pulling over because the police can be in that spot in about 30 seconds. Being in the passenger seat in the right lane of the highway, I was about 10 feet from the body. Haunting image. Story 9. I was in the military. We were at training camp and doing rappel training. We had a recruit, 18 years old, that was next in line. He kept saying stuff like, "Drill sergeant, my equipment is malfunctioning, drill sergeant," and "Drill sergeant, I need help with my equipment, drill sergeant." Of course, the drill sergeant thought he was just being a, quote, stupid recruit. After saying a bunch of funny, hateful stuff to the kid that made everyone want to laugh, he said, "You have 3 seconds to rappel, recruit," and started counting. At that point, you could see the fear in the kid's eyes, and we started to realize he was very serious. When the drill sergeant finished counting, he put his hand on the recruit's chest, pushed him, and the kid fell 60 feet straight backwards, landing flat on his back. The sound that came out of this kid when he hit the ground, the gurgling, all of it, I'll never forget it. I was later in the first sergeant's waiting room, and our captain was in the office with him. I could overhear the phone conversation with the parents. They assured them we did everything we could, but, insert name of recruit, did not ensure their equipment was properly secured and suffered a malfunction due to his oversight, and that they were in the hospital in critical condition. He died before the end of the night. 2 years later, multiple high-ranking military personnel and NCOs were investigated for similar incidents at that facility. However, I don't know if that instructor ever got in any trouble or if the family received any closure. Anyone in any position of power, whether that be a manager of a store or a drill sergeant, who refuses to believe that they could be mistaken about something, that the person who is telling them something, their subordinate, could be right, is an awful person. Just take a second to consider it at the very least. It is absolutely no skin off your back. It's not even like you were wrong about something. It's just this guy's telling you that something's not right and you don't believe him. So you push him to his death. And then the audacity to cover it up. I hate everyone involved in this story. Story 10. This is technically a homicide but was ruled as self-defense. I was 13F. My then 18-year-old brother and his 18-year-old wife lived next door to a family with a teenage son. She started an affair with that 17-year-old son. One day, the son barged into my brother's place and started attacking him. I don't know why, but the wife didn't seem to want to move away with my brother to the army or some dumb crap. My brother was packing and moving because he was leaving for the army. He had pulled down a metal pole in a closet to make room for boxes. My brother grabbed that pole and used it to fight off the teen. The kid ran out bleeding. My brother called my dad. We lived a few blocks down the street, and my dad jumped into action. He grabbed one of his hunting shotguns and some bird ammo. He ran out the door to the car screaming for us to call 911. My mom and I ran after him because we were clueless and wanted to see where he was headed. My mom was on the phone with the cop, and they were dispatching the one cop we had in our town. We start running down the road to my brother's place because we saw Dad pull in. As we get near, we hear a gunshot and see my dad and brother taking cover behind the car doors they'd opened to climb in and leave. Another shot goes off and we can see it isn't my dad firing. The teen had run home next door and was bleeding, and told his dad my brother was trying to murder him. His dad grabbed his handgun and saw my dad and brother leaving and started shooting. That's the gunfire Mom and I heard. Dumb us kept running towards my dad's car. I saw my dad position his shotgun in the car window and fire round one. Then he and my brother climbed in the car and started driving back at us/home. We finally get together and Dad says he shot the man in the stomach. Chaos breaks out on our street. Ambulance, cops, and people. They take away the other dad to the hospital and my dad into custody. Within hours, we find out the man has died. The bird shot hit his liver and he bled out. Turns out he was an alcoholic and his liver was not going to survive the trauma. My dad was charged with murder and we started receiving death threats. In the cover of a night we moved. We hid for days until my dad was bonded out. Ended up moving far away. Grand jury was convened, and I had to testify to what I saw. After all the evidence and testimony was presented, my father wasn't charged, because the grand jury decided it was self-defense. We never talked about what happened or anything. Things carry on as normal. That day is forever burned into my memory. I want to add this. My dad never recovered from taking a man's life, even though it wasn't intentional. He ended up hooked on H after the church couldn't save him. We lost him to his demons in 2008. My brother has done well for himself, but he had his own battles that he fights daily. I'm not pro or anti-gun. I just wish this had never happened because so many lives were changed. My brother divorced her after he left for the army. She's gone from our lives forever. It's definitely unsettling to think how quickly a life can be changed, let alone ended, and how many lives are affected by one thing. I'm glad the courts ruled in your favor, OP, but I'm not glad for the situation at all. Just senseless violence. This whole thing could have been dealt with in any way, and this was the way they chose. Truly unfortunate. Story 11. A drunk man was pushed down some stairs by the bouncer. Unfortunately, the drunk man was unable to catch himself and instead spun around and landed on the pavement with the back of his head, making first contact. He was alive for a little while, but quickly succumbed to his wound, and arrested there on the pavement. He was declared dead 15 minutes later in the ED after being transported by ambulance. There was no CCTV or clear evidence of malicious intent that would hold up in court, and the man was known as a drunk and had no friends or family. It was ruled as an accidental death. I had to walk past that spot most days going to work, and I will never forget his face. The look of mystified horror, followed by the glassy-eyed, slack-jawed expression that came with the death. I was the medic that transported the man. I was by his side from start till the declaration. One of the most visceral experiences of my career so far. Story 12. When I was a kid, I witnessed a hit and run. An SUV ran into a pedestrian and sped away. I don't think they ever caught the person. The poor girl they hit flew into the air. The SUV passed underneath her. She landed on the road and died. It was heartbreaking. She couldn't have been over 25. Granted, this wasn't murder, but I just couldn't believe there was a person there 1 second and then just gone the next. It always made me wonder how people could live with themselves after doing that. Then I'd wonder how many people I knew would do the same thing. Eventually, I wondered if I was capable of doing something like that too. All it's made me realize is hypotheticals are dumb, because we never really are who we think we are. I also appreciate every year I get older. Story 13. I was riding my bike to work when I witnessed a man drive over his girlfriend in a parking lot. I was the first person to approach and I was sure this woman was going to die. I heard the truck before I looked, and I watched as she was run over completely with the truck. I watched as both sets of tires ran her over. It was and is the most horrible thing I've witnessed in my life. I was probably 100 to 150 feet away, and as soon as he pulled away, I had to have an internal argument with myself about approaching. Like, I didn't want to see a dead, mangled person up close, but if there was any chance she was still alive, I didn't want her to be alone. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. And then I went over. She was alive and conscious. I tried to comfort her and started calling 911, but she only spoke Spanish, so I wasn't able to really communicate with her. Another woman had seen as well, and she came running over from across the street. She was able to come over and talk with her in Spanish while I called 911. I think she was able to help her call some family, since I think we were all uncertain if the woman would live. The ambulance showed up pretty quickly and stabilized her. After she was taken away, I went to work and I tried not to think about it. I actually actively avoided learning about the story until now, because the uncertainty of whether she died or not allowed me to believe she was okay. I didn't want to know if she died. This post actually prompted me to look up whether she lived or not, and this is the first time I've ever tried to look up anything about that day. I'm happy she made it and I hope she's doing well. Seeing someone try to murder someone changes you. I don't think about that day every day, but it definitely haunts me. OP, if you hadn't chose to walk up and check if she was alive, there's a good chance she wouldn't have made it. That help wouldn't have come in time. You could have saved crucial seconds or maybe even a minute or two. You did an incredible thing, an awful situation to have to witness, but I'm glad she made it too. And for once, I'm glad that the answer to the prompt didn't actually answer it fully. Story 14. Was working in the off-campus residences at my university. Over Christmas break, when most of the students had gone home, I was still there keeping an eye on the place. I was in my little office that was in one of the apartment blocks when I heard a pop, 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 pop noise. It really just sounded like some kids were letting off small fireworks in the stairwell or something. I looked out of my office window, which was just outside of the bottom of the stairwell facing south, to see if I could see what was up. As I looked out, 3 to 4 dudes come running down the stairs and take off running to the east, toward the complex entrance. About 10 seconds later, another dude comes down the stairs and slowly walks off toward the southwest. I went outside to check and see if/what damage had been caused by the fireworks, and went up the stairwell. As I got to the top, there was no firework debris or smoke or anything, but I saw a cell phone lying on the ground, and a single small hole in the wall outside the door of one of the units. At the other end of the corridor, there was another stairwell, and at the bottom of that, there was an old beater car just idling with the headlights on, and a few of the doors just hanging open. Something was definitely fishy about it. I definitely had the what if those were gunshots thought, but there was no gunpowder smell or blood or anything besides that one little hole. To play it safe, I called the cops, who said they were sending someone over. The station is very close to the housing complex, and they were there in less than a minute. I gave them a quick summary of what I saw, and they split up to go in the directions I told them that the people had headed. It was less than 30 seconds later that they found the lone guy had gone off to the southwest. Turns out he had been shot multiple times, and had managed to walk across the parking area and turn behind a building before collapsing on the grass. They tried CPR, but when the ambulance arrived, the paramedics pronounced him dead on the scene. The other cops who had gone east did find the other guy and arrested them. I ended up having to go testify in court during the trial of the guy that was supposedly the shooter. I told them basically what I wrote up here, but didn't know any of the people involved and never saw faces or anything of real help to the police. I think I was basically there to establish a timeline or something like that. Anyhow, I heard it was basically a drug deal gone wrong. 2 different gangs from 2 different counties thought that the residents' apartments would be empty over the holidays and set up a deal. One party tried to rip off the other party and someone got shot. As I understand it, the shooter guy got sent to prison. Story 15. 5 years ago, there was an attempted home invasion at my house when I was 18. I was downstairs watching Top Gear when I heard someone trying to break in the door. My father, military type, very protective, confronted the guy, and the guy turned around and shot my dad in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun. My dad was able to fire off a couple shots afterwards, ending him, but my father was already on the ground, dead. This is the very short version. First time writing this out, still surreal to think about. Turned out the guy was a felon with 6 butcher knives down his pants, presumably trying to find some reason to hurt someone. I consider my father a hero. Most people considered his actions stupid or irresponsible, local internet commenters, but you had to know him to understand his mentality. I was 5 feet behind my father the whole time. I'll never forget holding my father in my arms, holding his gunshot wound. Story 16. I was at the grand opening of a sports bar the night that there was a big fight. The bar was jam-packed beyond belief, so packed you couldn't get back to your table without shimmying through the other patrons, trying not to put your butt on the back of their necks. Anyway, a guy who had paid, entered, and had some drinks went outside to take a smoke break. No smoking allowed in the bar. There was still an incredibly long line to get inside, so he tried to come back in the exit door. The bouncer told him that he couldn't, and that he would have to wait in line and come back in the main entrance, though he didn't have to pay again. The guy was upset and tried to push past the bouncer. The bouncer eventually pushed him out the door and locked it. The guy then apparently went back home, grabbed his girlfriend's gun, and came back to the bar. I learned this after the fact, talking to the owner and via news coverage. He waited until someone left out the exit door, snuck inside, and shot the bouncer in the back of the head several times. The bar was so packed that chaos ensued. Almost everyone hit the floor immediately. There were tables, food, drinks, keys, phones, and people all laying on the floor. Other people ran outside. My buddies and I waited for a few minutes until we knew the coast was clear, and then got the hell out of there. At the time, we didn't know all of what happened. As we exited the bar, we literally had to step over the dead bouncer to get to the door. I was lucky enough to find my phone and keys amid the melee. One of my buddies found his keys, but not his phone. He never got it back. Sadly, the sports bar never really recovered from that incident. It closed down for about a month before reopening, but it never achieved the popularity it should have due to that incident. Story 17. Happened while hanging out at my bestie's house. For context, I will explain that 1. Her house faced the side of a popular bar in our town. 2. That particular night her husband was pretty buzzed and had the fire pit out front blazing. And 3. They had taken in my guinea pigs in addition to theirs when I moved to a place that wouldn't allow them. So my boyfriend at the time and I at one point go to the basement to give out treats to the piggies. Through the open side door we could hear some commotion going on outside. Didn't think much of it at first, until I realized that my friend's inebriated husband could possibly be involved. Boyfriend and I run out the side door to find the husband nowhere in sight, and the commotion is coming from 2 guys across the street from the bar and 1 guy in the parking lot arguing. We go back into the basement where we found the husband. He had gone inside to grab a beer, and then came down the basement steps to gather more cardboard to burn while the fire pit was going, and the 3 of us begin to chat. Fast forward a few minutes, and we all hear pop, 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 pop. For a split second, we all just look at each other wide-eyed, knowing those pops were unquestionably gunshots. The 3 of us run out the side door again just in time to see one of the guys from across the street is now in the bar parking lot, and the other guy involved in the argument shoots him 5 more times. The victim goes down and the shooter stands over him and shot him 3 more times before taking off, running up my bestie street. Probably the worst part was that the victim's mom was inside the bar. Her cries were heartbreaking to hear. Later learned the victim lived across the street from the bar, and his 2 young children ended up seeing their dad bleed out through a window. The murderer was found within the hour and stated the argument was over $20 and a woman they were both trying to date. He was charged with first-degree murder and 13 counts of wanton endangerment. Story 18. So I live in a country where it's pretty normal for public buses to steal each other's routes, schedules, whatever. When I was 8, I was in one of those buses, and my driver was the one acting wrongfully. Along comes another bus. This is early in the morning. Both buses are full. I was going to school, 2nd grade. The driver of the other bus stops my bus. Both drivers get off to yell at each other. The second driver has a gun, but he is older/more feeble. So my driver grabs the gun and shoots him once. I saw everything as I was sitting by a window. When the body falls and I see the red stain, the world goes quiet for me. The last thing I heard was the soft gunshot, .22 caliber maybe. I get off the bus and walk to school 20 to 25 blocks away. I don't remember a single thing about it. When I got to school, I was pale and wouldn't react when spoken to. Eventually, I came to and was able to speak normally and matter-of-factly. Can't stand the noise of fireworks since. Story 19. A couple of years ago when I was still in college, I was coming back to my dorm room at night when I heard 2 to 3 loud pops and someone screaming in pain. I went up to my room and out the window, saw a handful of cops blocking off the street around the corner from my building. Turns out the campus police received an anonymous tip that a man was armed outside the dorm down the street from mine. When they arrived, the man took out a knife and charged one of the officers. He ignored the officer's warnings, so the officer ended up shooting him. They took him to the hospital, but he died on the way there. It was later found out that the anonymous tip came from the man, who was actually a student. It was declared that he took his own life by police. So technically not murder, but it led to some pretty terrible events in the week that followed before the official report came out. I feel terrible for whatever led that student to thinking that that was their way out. Whatever was going on in their head that told them that that was the answer. It's unfortunate that not only did they take their own lives, but the way they ended up going about it is one of the most impactful to people around them. I don't want to diminish whatever mental struggles the student was going through, but my heart also goes out to the cop who had to take the shot. For most people, taking a life will affect them greatly, no matter the circumstances around it. Story 20. I have several. My neighbor apparently was mixed up with the cartels. I grew up in New Mexico. They evidently ran foul of them. One night, 5 people surrounded their trailer and opened fire. This was about 3 a.m. I was sleeping. I rolled out of my bed and hit the floor. We were at a club for teenagers one night when I was 15. An acquaintance of mine was hitting on this girl in the parking lot. Said girl was the GF of a gangbanger. Said gangbanger pulled out a .25 and shot dude in the face for hitting on his girlfriend. I was walking home from a movie one day. I hear a screech like tires skidding. I look over and there was a head-on collision. Dude flew through the windshield, died instantly. The other driver was arrested and charged for drunk driving causing a death. Story 21. Southern France, Corsica in the late 90s. I was in a bar with my girlfriend at the time having a drink. We were inside, but there were also tables outside in the narrow medieval alley. Suddenly, 2 gunshots ring out. Unlike elsewhere in Europe, guns are not that unusual in Corsica, so people take cover and dive under tables, music stops and such, but there's no huge drama. People are kind of used to this stuff. I look at the barman and he shrugs. I head for the door to see what's going on and step out into the alley. In front of me lies a guy, no more than 20 years old. He's in the fetal position, very peaceful looking, but is clearly dead. His brains are all over the wall. All tables are empty. Also in the restaurant across the alley, more and more people come out of the bar. We all look at the dead guy. There's a clear sense of let's get out of here. I find my girlfriend and we leave. Later we hear that the dead guy was a waiter. He intervened in an argument a customer had with his girlfriend, told him to keep it down. Customer got up, pulled out a gun and shot the waiter in the head. I still sometimes think about how he lay there so peaceful. It made me realize how quick it can all end for you. just like that. Story 22. It's not exactly murder, maybe. I guess you can decide. I'll try to make it a fast one. I was a medic in Afghanistan. A few people got injured in an IED blast, one of which was a kid around 14-15. We had limited resources, so sometimes you can only save a certain number of people. Those who are most likely to be saved. The immediate casualties come first, and sometimes you have to let the others who are too far gone kinda just sit there, I guess. You make them comfortable and talk to them a bit, but there's not much you can do. Anywho, the reason I equate it to murder is when we saw what we had in numbers, we realized we couldn't save one. A guy that had lost quite a bit in the blast. There wasn't much we could do for the kid, so I gave him some pain meds to help him relax and help him sleep. And he did. He went to sleep and never got to wake up. It was a murder in the grand scheme, depending on your viewpoint, but I truly felt like I was the one dealing the final blow, even if it was for mercy. He was a local. I never got to learn his name or anything about him, apart from the short time I spent with him before working on other casualties. Story 23. My neighborhood is pretty wild, so there are probably even better stories, but the one I remember is this. It was about 5 years ago. This gang leader man, he was a big deal, Mafia connections and stuff, had just got released from prison. I don't know much about the backstory, but he had some dirt with a nightclub owner that happened to be my neighbor. The gang attacked the nightclub that night. Tables were thrown off windows, fire alarms went on, and we obviously heard gunshots back to back. Me and my dad rushed to the balcony, very dumb of us, and we saw this naked guy with only a towel around his waist who was walking out of hammam. Hammam is like a public bath. I'm Turkish, it's common here. The man ran to the nightclub, I guess he was curious, and then, boom. I saw the exact moment he got shot from his chest. We later found out he was the only one who died that night. Nobody inside the nightclub was harmed. Story 24. Me and my friends were on the bus. When the door opened, a guy ran in and pulled someone off the bus by his hair. Once outside, with one smooth and clean motion, slit his neck. It seemed like a professional hit, but I don't know for sure. We rushed to help him, but he died within seconds. Another time I was in Guatemala, and there was a guy on a motorcycle in front of us. Another car pulled up next to him and ran him off the road. We saw him get launched off the road onto the rocks. My brother-in-law went to get help for him. When he came back, his clothes were covered in blood and said nothing. He talked to the police and EMTs, and the rest of our car ride was silent. The final time, I was asleep. It was about 3 a.m. and I heard shouting and footsteps. I went outside to check on it. It was really loud, so my next-door neighbor had also heard it. He works at the ER. When I got there, he was helping a man who had been stabbed several times around the abdomen. I called 911 and applied pressure to one of the stab wounds. When the EMTs arrived and took them away, I asked my neighbor if we saved that guy's life. He told me nothing was for sure, but that he didn't think the guy was going to make it. Story 25. Around 1970, I was walking down Broadway in a commercial district in Seattle on the weekend in the early afternoon. I passed a cop who had stopped a man riding a Harley on the curbside. Suddenly, the perp pulled out a .45, and when the cop saw the gun, he ran across 4 lanes of traffic to the store, Market Time Variety across the street, and sought cover behind the edge of the building. As he ran, the perp fired his gun at him repeatedly, but all the rounds missed. I was frozen with fear and just watched, transfixed. The perp backed into the entranceway of a shop and continued firing. The cop raised his service revolver two-handed and squeezed off several shots. They all hit the guy. A few hit his chest. The thunk when struck was sickening. He collapsed. The cop holstered his gun and ran back across the street, pulled the guy out of the doorway and rolled onto his back, and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Didn't help. Guy was stone dead. I'll never forget it. Story 26. I was at a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert in Camden, New Jersey back in the early 2000s. Our high school friend group went down hours before the show to get drunk in the parking lots. The guy across the road from us was selling nitrous balloons out of his trunk. There's what's known as the Nitrous Mafia in Philadelphia, who basically run the nitrous balloon selling game at all major events. They came by and told this kid to shut his tank off and get off their turf. The kid basically told him to screw off. About an hour later, they returned, walked up behind him, and slit his throat. Our friend ran and flagged down a bike EMT, and we all went into the show. On our way into the show, a group of much older, very drunk Delco trash jumped us and beat us up pretty good, because they didn't like what we were wearing, I think. Pretty terrible day. Story 27. I was walking home from the liquor store just a block away from my apartment in LA. It was 10 p.m. I pass a guy on the sidewalk. Another man about 20 feet away yells at him. I couldn't make out what he said. I just remember thinking, I don't want to get involved in that. Almost before the thought finishes, the second guy fires a gun at the first guy. I drop my chips and soda I brought, and without thinking or looking, I run across the street. 4 shots went off in total. I know one of them was at me because I saw the spark fly from it hitting the ground in front of me as I ran across the street. I saw the guy with the gun running parallel to me on the other side of the street, and suddenly it dawns on me, I need to call 911. By the time I look back at the street from my phone, The man was gone. The first guy died in the liquor store I was just at. I only went back once before I moved about 2 months later. I don't know how I didn't get shot, and I don't know anything about what led up to it. I was the only witness, and detectives told me that something like this was really uncommon in this neighborhood. Fireworks still scare me sometimes. Story 28. I was with my cousin, his father, and my father. This was 2010 Mexico. Mind you, my uncle and his soon-to-be ex-wife weren't getting along at all whatsoever. Anyway, it's a Sunday and it's getting late, so we get in the car to drop off my cousin next town. Since my uncle wasn't getting along with his wife, we parked down the street at a corner store. So as my uncle is saying bye to his son, a guy in a hoodie, we didn't know this at the time, but it was my aunt's brother, started chasing my uncle around the car with a knife. They made 3 laps around the car, and that's when my dad stepped out of the vehicle with his 9mm Beretta and emptied the clip on this guy. My dad, being a hunter and army veteran, didn't miss a shot from his 14-round clip. Guy was dead before he hit the floor. My dad then fled the country, only to be arrested and brought back. Yeah, it was dumb for him to flee, but it was an unregistered firearm. Anyway, he did 2 years in prison for possession of an illegal firearm. This incident destroyed our family, but it's been a decade now and we've managed to get back on our feet. It's rare for me to hear from my father, but he gives me a call every now and then. It really is unfortunate the firearm was owned illegally, because if not, then OP's father is just regarded as a hero. He didn't do anything wrong. It was the purest form of self-defense I could think of. Just a garbage situation to have a family torn up because of something like that. It just doesn't need to happen. I don't care how much you hate your ex. Well, okay, there might be a few scenarios where I might look the other way. But apart from those, it's just a stupid way to handle anything, let alone a divorce. Story 29. Worked in a pub when I was younger, walking around cleaning tables and emptying ashtrays. Back in the days you could smoke indoors, and a couple of guys are standing at a high table talking. Another guy comes in and starts shouting with one of the group, getting a bit heated, so I ask them to calm it down and remove all empty glasses and bottles from the area. As I'm talking to them, the lone guy lunges with a knife, misses me but goes in the chest of the other. He moves into a bear hug with the guy he just stabbed and continues to stab him a further 14 times in the back before running out of the building. Spent what seemed like hours putting pressure on the stab wounds waiting for an ambulance, but the guy was dead before they got there. Police caught the guy. I gave a statement and spent a few days in court giving evidence and helping get the guy jailed. Not something I ever want to experience again, as it screwed me up for quite some time. Story 30. In the 1980s, I was touring the ship Queen Mary, which was permanently docked at Long Beach, California. They were hosting a motorcycle show on board that day, and the idiots had hired the Hells Angels as security. Open staircases were attached to the ship on the outside, allowing one to climb from the pavement level to entryways at any level of the ship. I was standing on the lowest landing of the staircase, about 10 feet above ground, when the rival Mongols Motorcycle Club showed up. Of course, a brawl broke out, immediately below me, with knives, fists, and chains. I saw Mongol stab a Hell's Angel in the back, just as a string of police cars were coming over the causeway to break it up. I read in the paper that night that the Hell's Angel had been stabbed in the kidney and had died. Surprisingly, it was the only fatality of the brawl. Story 31. My dad was murdered when I was a kid. We lived in a crappy part of Florida, and he was very young, 26. People came into the apartment after the babysitter walked in. He was going somewhere that night, and she was coming to watch my brother and me. My brain blocked most of it out, but I know they were there to rob my family. There was some altercation and a rapid fire of a handgun. I was in a back room, but my brother was right there, and he suffers ear damage to this day. I've had lots of PTSD counseling, so I'm not as freaked out by it anymore. I've always wanted to make a podcast about it or something. I know which prison the gunman is at. I think it's an interesting story, though, because the newspapers conflated the case and accused random people, and basically ruined any real justice that could have come from the situation. It was bizarre for my family. Story 32. My friend comes to visit from Florida for one night. We're at an after-hours club and I have a fake ID, but he's of age. We're outside smoking. Some dude pulls up in a white car and walks over screaming with a gun to the bouncer. The bouncer pulls out his own gun and shot him 6 times. Turns out bouncer was sleeping with the guy's wife. Guy fell on the hood of his white car, covering it in blood, and died. Cops showed up. Girl we were talking to outside has a big mouth and is telling the cops that her and I saw everything. And the bouncer wasn't the shooter, it was a drive-by. She was drunk and wrong. Cops grabbed me, her and my Florida friend as witness to an alleged but false drive-by and brought us downtown. I filled out all the paperwork under my fake ID. Eventually came clean and admitted that I was underage and that the ID was fake once he started questioning its validity. Cop was upset, but let it ride. We had to stay downtown for 11 hours throughout this whole process of basically saying no, this girl was wasted. It was the bouncer, as they already knew. They gave us cheese sandwiches and let us smoke cigarettes in the station, but overall it was an absolutely drunken, terrible, and sleepless night. The friend I was visiting with from Florida never came back to visit. No witnesses like drunk witnesses. I can only imagine the extra paperwork and trouble she caused the police. That being said, even though the bouncer was sleeping with the dude's wife, which is obviously, not great, he was getting a gun waved around in his face, so justified shooting, I guess? This is a morally strange situation. Story 33. This happened in 2007 or around that. At the time, my block was the border of 2 gang territories and basically had shootings every day. There was one time someone was shooting down the street for a gang initiation of some sort or maybe a gang fight. I was too young to understand those details, although I remember seeing a lady in a blue car parked at the corner. I'm not too sure on the details here, but she was panicked and we waited for the EMS to arrive. Although what I do remember, bright as day, is the fire department laying her on a stretcher, using a hand respirator on her, and whisking her away. Story 34. I used to live in a real bad neighborhood that had a lot of drugs and gang violence. I swear that street had been shut down due to drug lab raids at least twice a year. There was a drug dealer who lived across the street, and had a really nice Dodge Charger that I loved. One night I guess a drug deal went wrong, and I heard a lot of yelling, so I looked out the window and saw the car up in flames. A few days as I'm getting home, I see the same guy running down the street as 3 to 4 guys are chasing him. One of the guys caught up to him and beat him to death with a baseball bat. We moved out within the year. Story 35. 2011. Leavenworth, Kansas. I was in the military at the time, and a few of us decided to go off post to bullcrap around the local Walmart. On the way back, we were driving when we heard shots. Having the training we've had, we immediately knew it was a firearm, not some fireworks or whatever. Turned to look and there was a man running around cars in a barbershop parking lot trying to evade gunfire. He didn't make it. A few months later I got out, went home. About a year later, the Leavenworth County prosecutor called, said I had to go back and testify. Felt like I was being watched the whole time I was in town. Haven't been back since. I've done horrible things and seen horrible things, but one of the worst is the sound of the victim's mother screaming in court as I described her son's death to a judge. Story 36. I'm exposed to this stuff pretty regularly. Not murders, but death, period. But the ones that stick with me the most are the wrong way drivers. The most recent was on December 27th. This family was headed home. You can see where they tried to avoid each other because the driver's sides on both vehicles were totally destroyed. The family man saved his wife's life by doing that. Long story short, we had to cut both cars up to get them out. Family man died before we could get him out, but still had to perform life-saving measures since he was conscious when we got there. His 12-year-old daughter had a deep laceration down to her skull and is probably going to lose her eye, and his wife had some type of head trauma. The drunk driver survived, of course, with a broken leg. I'm a little callous to stuff like this by now, but the timing bothered me a lot. I just thought how just 2 days before they were celebrating Christmas, and this absolute jerk ruined their lives forever. I forgot to mention that family man's son was in another vehicle behind them and saw the whole thing go down, and saw us trying to get his parents and sister out. I felt for the kid seeing his dad in the condition he was in. Unfortunately, that wasn't my first or last time seeing this type of thing. Story 37. Many years ago, I was at a pizza joint in Stockton for a company party. It was one of those pizza places that has those long benches and tables, so different groups wind up sitting pretty close to each other sometimes. If you're aware, Stockton is Northern California's version of South Central LA, so there must have been a few different gangs here at the time. It was a big place and I think a Friday or a Saturday evening. I don't know what was going on, but some gang melee broke out and a guy who was before this sitting peacefully directly across the table from me had his head cracked open with one of those super heavy glass mugs with the handle and heavy base. He went down in a big pool of blood. I wanted no part of this and I walked right to the front door, and in that time cops were already running in. I found out a few days later he died in a hospital. Story 38. I'm not sure if the guy died, but I definitely at least saw an assault with a deadly force. I grew up in a kind of rough town up until I transferred from community college. One day I was outside the library when I saw an older man and younger man obviously in an argument about something. The older man was dressed smart casual. In my mind's eye, he's wearing a brown sweater and red chinos with leather shoes. He definitely had glasses on, as I distinctly remember them getting knocked off his face. The younger man to me was more nondescript. He was likely in whatever streetwear was fashionable at the time. This would have been around 2015, so maybe some tight jeans, bright colors, and some article of clothing with a Sesame Street character. The argument was too far for me to hear its actual subject. Could have been a family conflict or a classmate dispute, maybe just two strangers who'd felt disrespected in the moment. They're really in each other's faces, and honestly my default attitude is that the young man must have done something jerkish to instigate this. Cooler heads prevail, and they both begrudgingly untangle themselves and head out in opposite directions. They're maybe 20 feet apart when the older man sneaks a backward glance, pivots, and starts stalking up behind the young man. As he approached, nobody said a word. Maybe the bystander effect had us all. Maybe we're all just shocked because we made the assumption that the older man must have been the righteous here. His first punch lands clean on the side of the young man's head. but it doesn't drop him. His second swing goes wide as the young man ducks and swings around to respond. The melee starts, and so do the newly awakened calls to stop the violence. From what I remember, both men were sloppy, but the young man was faster. Eventually, a wide hook lands flush on the older man's face, and he goes down. This is when the murder potentially starts. I don't remember if the older man went down cleanly or if he attempted to get up and was knocked back down by more blows from the young man's higher position. I do remember that once the older man was still, the young man's temper was still flared. He kicked the prone man in the ribs and yelled at him, and all of us, about cheap shots and cowardice. No one responds. The young man, still in a fury, stomps on the head of the older man. I don't remember if he was face up or on his belly. The first stomp again solicited no verbal response from the newly formed crowd. I don't believe his foot landed cleanly, and the older man, or at least his body, also gave no reply to the stomp. The second stomp, however, woke us all from our stupors and sent the older man's arms and legs into spasms. A cacophony of general protests arose, but had no effect on the young man, who gave a third stomp with similar effect. After this, a friend of mine stepped forward from the crowd and directly pleaded with the young man to stop. This got the young man's attention, and after some back and forth about no one seeming to care when the young man was initially attacked, he stormed off, as the crowd hesitantly parted for the possible murder suspect. I believe I was the first to call the police, who seemed wholly uninterested in responding now that the attacker was no longer in my field of vision. It was evident that no one in the area had medical training, as the old man was left to his own devices, save for some concerned strangers standing idly near him waiting for the police to come. It was roughly 15 minutes before campus security came and began working on the man, and another 30 after that before we heard sirens in the parking lot. I never got a call back to give a testimony or description of the young man, and I never received a crime alert from our campus notification system. As far as I know, the young man got off without consequence. Story 39. So, does war count as murder? I was in Iraq during the surge. Saw plenty of people have horrible things happen to them. The first one, I didn't even have time to acknowledge that a guy in the Humvee died next to me. I was busy trying not to get murdered. To think about it, I didn't even know it. I absolutely crapped myself and didn't know about that until later on. A few years later, I ended up in prison. My second day at my facility, as we were leaving the yard, I saw a guy move up and stab a dude probably 10 or so times in his back and side. He crumpled to the ground. I did what the guy next to me did. Shut my freaking mouth, step over the body, and kept moving. My reaction was more of a, so that's what a knifing in prison looks like. The one that actually sticks with me is the 18-year-old kid who got gang beat by 5 guys. His screams at first and his subsequent crying are around with me to this day. I don't have much issue with human death. There are things worse than death. Story 40. Was playing a show back in 2013 in downtown San Jose, California on a Friday night. Just finished my last set and was outside smoking a cigarette with a friend. Looked down the street and saw 2 good-looking women with a guy standing on the corner waiting to cross the street. Some dude was jaywalking across a busy street, which caught my eye. As he approached the guy with the 2 girls, he just sucker-punched the guy as hard as he could, which I heard from half a block away. Dude fell back and cracked his head on the curb. The girls started screaming. Me and my buddy run over to see if we can help, but no. This dude was convulsing and bleeding out of his ears and chewing his tongue to shreds. The girls take their tops off to try to use as pillows/bandages, and a few moments later, dude stopped moving. All that was left was just a river of blood leaking out of his skull and ears. Cops showed up moments later, took vitals, and 5 minutes later the guy had a white sheet over him. Don't know if they caught the guy that hit him. Story 41. When I was 13, me and a friend stayed up all night practicing our best Britney Spears choreography when we heard some noise outside. We peeked out the window and saw a man beating up his pregnant girlfriend in their front yard. Then a group of men jumping another off to the side. One pulled out a gun and unloaded into the guy they were beating up. They then stuffed him in a car and drove away. Police tried to get us to identify suspects in the case, but I could never really be sure on the potential suspects they showed us. The second murder happened on that street just about a year ago. We were unloading groceries from our car one evening when these 2 white males who were loitering on the corner close to our house ran out into the street in front of a moving vehicle and unloaded a gun into the windshield. My mom ran into the house when she heard the gunfire, but I froze like a deer in the headlights. It happened so quickly. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran inside and my mom was calling 911. When police arrived, I saw the shooter speaking to police and called an officer over to let him know what I had saw. Turns out the men were undercover officers in a drug sting. They murdered this man. They never identified themselves as officers to the suspect or anyone. Story 42. When I was 6 years old, after school, my best friend Victor and I got off the bus, lived across the street from one another, and he had invited me to come with with him to change clothes so we could play at the nearby park together. I went with, and we were racing each other across the busy street. Ran through bushes, our shortcut, and made it just out the perimeter of his yard when we came to an abrupt halt. We stared as my friend's dad was yelling very, very loudly at my friend's dad's brother. I slowly kept creeping forward as to get to my friend's trailer house when we heard them threatening to murder one another. My friend, of course, didn't want that to happen and ran towards his father, as I was still creeping closer in between these men fighting. Almost in 1 second, my friend got to his father. His uncle had pulled out a gun. He yelled something like, "I hate you, mother fricker," and we both witnessed the uncle shoot my friend's father in the chest. My friend screamed out and wailed, as I stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. His uncle ran up to my friend, and his dad, who had fallen to the ground, and kicked my friend to the ground. I yelled out in a concerned and trembling voice, "Victor!" My friend put his hand up and screamed, "Run, call the police." Shocked and scared, my little 6-year-old legs did just that. I ran as fast as I could through the bushes, crossed the street with tears streaming down my face, not looking both ways, as I heard a second gunshot go off behind me. Made it to my mom's apartment and called 911. The police came. My friend's dad was pronounced dead at the scene. At school the next day, my dear friend wasn't there. Never showed up again. I knew in my gut that the second gunshot had taken my friend's life as well. We were just two little 6-year-olds trying to go to the park after school, and we got caught in the crosshairs of family violence. A part of me died that day. I eventually moved and went to therapy, and even my therapist claimed it was a false memory that I had believed to be real from a bad dream experience. I got in contact with this friend's relatives later in life, and they confirmed what I had remembered. That's my story. Okay, what kind of therapist tells you, no, you didn't live through this? Unless they're 100% certain, because surely there is some record of this happening. I mean, just the fact that you called people and they confirmed it, right? Unless you're experiencing some intense psychosis. What an absolutely horrific thing. Shooting a child? I don't think there are words in the English language to describe what a garbage person that guy is. OP, I am truly deeply sorry for what happened. Not only losing a friend, but having to essentially witness it happening. I know it doesn't mean much, but my heart goes out to you. I hope you find a therapist that believes you too. Story 43. Tragically, I don't believe this qualifies as murder, though I believe it should. Closest definition I could find was depraved heart manslaughter, but I could be wrong. The day before Halloween this year, I was at a red light at the crazy intersection in my neighborhood with one car in front of me. Our light turns green, so the car in front of me starts to slowly accelerate. Quicker than any of us could process, from our left, a mid-sized SUV-type vehicle comes barreling through his now red light at least 3 to 4 seconds after it had turned. He clipped and took off the front bumper of the girl's car in front of me, lost control of his car, and smashed it directly into a grandmother waiting at a bus stop, ending her instantly. She had just picked up a pizza for her family and was on her way home. The man's car tipped onto his driver's side, so I'm not sure how he got out as quickly as he did, but he had the gall to start yelling at the girl whose bumper he took off, saying it was her fault for being in the intersection during our green light. This was after she literally spilled out of her car door wailing. She couldn't believe she'd been a part of it. I was the first one to call 911, and the operator asked if anyone could perform CPR. I remember telling her that there wasn't anything left of her to perform CPR on. To my knowledge, the police deemed it an accident, and nothing happened to the man. As one bystander said to me, "We just witnessed that man make the worst mistake of his life." We did, and I hope it never, ever leaves him. Story 44. Ear witness to my brother's murder and eyewitness to the perp escaping. Identified his body at the scene 30 years ago. He was just with his girlfriend to look at some puppies when a jealous ex-husband decided to take matters into his own hands and murder every man at the house and his ex. He shot 4 people but only ended one. The man who never should have met his ex-wife before that night. My brother. I heard it all happen and identified him at the scene. I can live with all of that. The one thing I still can't live with is how horribly I handled telling my mom when I had to call them home. I should have told my dad instead so he could handle it in person. That wail she let out was worse than hearing the people shot cry out for help through all their pain. Story 45. I've got 3 of them. First was in the early 90s. I was in a convenience store playing Fatal Fury or some crap, and I heard a pop followed by squealing tires. I thought it was a car backfiring, but I ran outside and saw a guy sitting on the sidewalk holding his stomach. Blood was starting to flow on the ground and a crowd gathered, so I went back inside to watch from a more secure location. There was a homeless black guy in there with me who was refusing to leave the store because he thought the police would blame him. He just said they're going to arrest the first black guy they see. Found out later on the news that the guy died. Second was ear witness only, and in the early 2000s. I was doing whatever on the computer when I heard a series of pops. My neighborhood wasn't a great one, so I was used to overnight gunfire and didn't want to get involved. In the morning, the house next door was crawling with police. Turns out 3 college kids were murdered execution style overnight. I left town shortly afterwards. Last one was also ear witness, and only a few months ago. I live next to a biker bar, and while it's been pretty quiet because of COVID, there was an incident over the summer where I was just falling asleep when I heard loud bikes going up and down the street. Then there was that pop. I knew instantly what it was, reported it with the police, and went to sleep. Next morning, the police have my street sectioned off and there's a crashed bike in the middle of it. They had already cleaned up the body, but there was still a bunch of blood everywhere. Apparently there was a bar fight the night before. Then someone chased down another biker and gunned him down in front of my apartment complex. Story 46. Recently, back in 2019. Motorcycle. I was riding with a group of 4. We were on an expressway, limited access, that was 2 lanes. Moderately full. I think 50 to 55 miles per hour because of traffic. The speed limit was 60. I'll always remember it. A 2018 lifted red F-150 decided to merge from the left lane to the right. He definitely looked behind him and saw me, placement 4, and another motorcycle in front of me, placement 3. He didn't look directly to his right, placement 2, and he went full force merging right, successfully cutting us off. He also hit the motorcycle to the right of him, pitting him to the ground and ending his life. The truck then slammed on his brakes after hitting the motorcycle. The person in front of me slammed into the back of his pickup and flew into the bed of the truck. I thankfully dodged the F-150 and went in front of him. 3 seconds later, the F-150 was tapped by another F-150. The lifted F-150 was upset that his brand new truck was damaged. He was getting in a fight with the other F-150 driver and the motorcyclist in his bed about the damages and was explaining that he would owe 2 trucks instead. He was apparently related to some lawyer and would sue for millions, completely forgetting he just hit 2 motorcycles. We searched for what felt like forever finding our friend. It was probably only 2 minutes. We got to him and he looked normal. No blood and helmet was still intact. We didn't touch him and were calling 911. He never responded to any questions. We shined a light in his eyes and they didn't respond. We ignored MSF and started removing his jacket to feel for a pulse and saw an unbelievable amount of blood. I wasn't prepared. I knew at that moment he was dead, but I tried my hardest to apply pressure. It wasn't helping. I started screaming at the lifted F-150 driver. I started screaming at my friend, placement 1, for deciding to go on a drive. I started screaming at my dead friend, placement 2, for dying. I cursed God for ending him. I blamed myself for convincing him to join us. I just wanted to die. I had to give up applying pressure to my friend, knowing he was dead, and decided to run in front of the expressway trying to get hit and die too. My friends held me down and forced me to the ground. I don't have health insurance, so I can't see counseling or therapy. I blame myself. I honestly don't want to live, but I just try to make ends meet. The lifted F-150 driver got his ticket dismissed because I was screaming, "I murdered him," during the crisis while my friends were tackling me. The driver never faced any consequences. He wasn't drunk or distracted, just stupid. But the system protected him instead of me. I was forced something from the paramedics and was taken to the hospital from ambulance. I had and have no insurance because I make too much for Medicare and food stamps, but I skip meals to pay rent. I have debt collectors for my medical debt because my friend died. I still have nightmares of the night. I witnessed a murder. My friend was hit by an inattentive driver. I lost my friend and all my others too because I can't talk to them anymore. I lost my job because I wouldn't ride my motorcycle to work and I can't afford a car. I have thousands in medical bills from overnight watch for people thinking I was going to take my own life. I wake up every night in panic. I can't get help because apparently medical care isn't a human right. I stopped going to classes because all I could think of was the blood. I'm living in my girlfriend's apartment now. I told more to you than I have to her, and I started sleeping on the sofa because I don't want to become too close. I don't know. The situation is screwed up. It wasn't until March that I started to receive food assistance. I'm still fighting for Medicare access. Insurance won't cover anything because I wasn't hit. I promised my girlfriend that as soon as I start seeing a therapist that I'll return to normal. I hope I can keep my promise. I'm still scared. I hope next year is better, but I doubt it will be. OP, I know you won't hear this, but for all intents and purposes, I agree with you that your friend was murdered. Sure, not by the definition of the law, but that driver's carelessness and belligerence really took your friend's life. And it sounds like it's done a number on yours too. This was posted a few years ago, so I hope that OP by now has gotten some good mental health help, despite the cost it comes with. OP sounds mad at the system, and I can't blame him in the slightest. To put it lightly, he really got screwed over here, and I'm wishing nothing but the best for you, man. Story 47. SO at the time and I lived top floor of a 12-story apartment building. We got home around 11 p.m. from a movie. 30 or so minutes later, we heard a domestic starting in the unit right across from our door. You could see their front door when looking out the peephole. After a couple minutes, it made its way into the hall, and I got to be nosy and look out the peephole. Turns out the girl who lived in the unit, her ex, father of her son, showed up because she was having problems with her current boyfriend who lived with her. The two men got physical, and the boyfriend stabbed the father 3 times in the chest with a steak knife. I watched from the peephole in our door and was completely frozen with fear. All I could do was tell my boyfriend to call the cops. Boyfriend took off down the stairwell. I opened the door and the father fell into our apartment and basically into my arms and lap. Paramedics arrived fast and rushed him to the hospital. Police apprehended the father on the same block. I gave a statement in the same clothes I was wearing, which had blood all over them. Still went to work next morning. I tried to call in, but my supervisor had no compassion, and I was only 20 and didn't know how to stand up for myself. The father survived, and we were later able to see him, and he thanked us for basically saving his life. Also went through the whole court system being key witnesses for about a year. As far as I know, the boyfriend is still in prison. This was 11 years ago. I don't think of this event often, but when I do, I still feel crappy inside for not opening the door sooner to try to stop it. Just coming in real quick here to say, OP, not opening the door is probably a good idea until the situation is more or less over. Putting yourself in the line of fire of someone who's clearly, in an irate state will more often than not end poorly for you. You did what you could, and you still managed to help save his life. You did great, OP, I promise. Story 48. When I was in high school and first years of college, in my country, a horrible wave of violence had started related to narco-trafficking and organized crime. My city was particularly affected by this, so I happened to witness 2 murders related to this, both on my way to college. First, I was on a bus headed to the subway. I saw a lot of soldiers out of a convenience store. It was super common to see soldiers on the streets back then, so it didn't bother me. However, there was a military truck in the parking lot, and I saw underneath the truck the legs of a man lying on the floor. In my 17-year-old mind, I thought he was just a homeless man asleep in the parking lot of the store. But a soldier approached him, pointed his gun to this man, and shot him. Thankfully, I didn't see the whole scene, but I saw when the soldier shot and how the legs of the man moved a bit, while blood was pooling on the soil, and then he didn't move anymore. Hours later, I saw on the news he was an extortionist. The second one was way worse. I was heading again to the college. I had to pass under a big vehicular bridge. Nothing remarkable, but that day a man was hanging from the neck with a chain on the highest point of that bridge. Next to him was a huge blanket with menacing text from some narco-trafficker against whichever enemy he had. I don't know if this man was already dead and it was the wind that was moving him, but it was so shocking. I had to take therapy for a long time to get over it. Story 49. Around 5 to 6 years ago, I was returning from a church at 7 or 8 at night. The country I live in gets dark fast. I hear a pair of screams coming from one of the close-by streets, which is usually peaceful, even at night. Now, and take into consideration that by the time this story happened, I was a pushy teenager who was relatively good at martial arts, I ran up to the street where the screams were coming from to see what was happening, only to see a middle-aged man on top of a motorcycle with a gun in his hands shooting an elderly woman twice. While the man picked up what I now, remembering this, assume was her purse from the ground, I fled the scene as soon as was possible, returning to the street that leads to the way back to my home. When I finally arrived back home, I didn't tell anything about this to my mother and obviously didn't call the police either. I realized what I did was very stupid, and I preferred to keep the secret as some macabre lesson from life. Although this isn't the only murder I saw in my life, it was the first one, and the most choking for me, due to my age at the moment and the context of the situation. Story 50. Warning, it involves a child. Let me preface to say that I wasn't in a bad neighborhood. It wasn't past midnight, and no, there was no justification for what happened. When you hear about someone witnessing a murder, you assume they were doing something or somewhere they shouldn't have been. That isn't my case. I thought murders happened in the shadow of night, and I used to think being at home was safe. It was the middle of the afternoon, and I was at my boyfriend's apartment. We were playing video games and heard shooting outside. We're on the second story, and we look at ground level in the common area and see a toddler face down, and a woman across the balcony yelling at a man approaching the toddler. At first, I thought maybe the kid fell and this woman was berating this man. No, he walked over to the unconscious toddler and began to stab it repeatedly with a metal object. We assumed it to be a knife, but we found out it was in fact a screwdriver. I screamed and turned away from the window and confirmed with my boyfriend what we saw. I began to call the police and he went for his gun. I hid out of sight because I didn't know if the man had a gun on him as well. On the phone, I described to the operator what's happening, what the suspect looks like, and where we are. Meanwhile, my boyfriend told the man to stop what he was doing. At that point, he was pacing around. When he didn't stop going for the child, my boyfriend shot him. Mind you, we're on the second floor. Where the man was standing in relation, it was not possible to aim higher than the hips, where the shot might have gone into another apartment on the ground floor. So he was hitting the leg and that got his attention. He then began to beg my boyfriend to please end him. He expressed how that kid was the best thing in his life and he deserved to die. At that time, I was still on the phone and I'm crying and asking the operator to please hurry for the police. I'm able to hear the whole exchange and I honestly didn't know what was going to happen next. The man stopped attacking the child and then the police showed up. My boyfriend lowered his weapon and took the bullet out of the chamber and ejected the magazine. He set it down and headed back in. He told me later he could see the fear in neighbors' eyes directed at him. The police came to our door and they brought us to the station and questioned us separately. We both had said we didn't know who that was or who the child was, and we'd had never seen them around the apartment before. However, after we returned, we realized that the man was one of the neighbors we'd seen on his patio and give a quick hello to. We'd hear him and his girlfriend argue loudly at times, but we weren't aware they had a child. The child didn't survive. The dad is in jail. Mom was at work when it happened. My boyfriend now has his license to carry and I'm working on mine. Today I bring my gun with me everywhere within the law. I get called a worrywart, thinking and preparing for the worst, but when you witness random violence, you start realizing danger is everywhere. Loud noises like fireworks scare me, and when I hear shouting or a disagreement, I stop everything I'm doing to figure out if there's danger. I've been in counseling for the past decade. I'm justifiably terrified. I'm always aware that anything can happen at any moment. But at the same time, I have a deeper appreciation for life. I know people say this a lot, but I actually mean it. I live every day like my last because you never know. I don't hurt people out of maliciousness or pettiness, and I don't say things I'll regret. I'm always honest. I'm open about my feelings because life is too short to beat around the bush. If I have something to tell you, I'll tell you. I believe in love. I believe in togetherness. I believe you can make the world a beautiful place. You just have to put your heart into it. I always tell my family and friends I love them. I've been wanting to share this experience with people, but it just flies over their heads, and you don't get it until you experience tragedy or loss. Thank you for giving me a place to share this. Story 51. When I was around 10, my godfather's son was outside of the motel my father and I lived at that my godfather and his son were visiting. My godbrother was about 16 at the time and caught some dude wearing some sort of racist crap and got up in his face. The guy pulled out a gun and shot him 3 times in the chest. We were in the pool area and my godbrother was on the sidewalk nearby within view. After he was shot, my godfather tackled the guy with the gun and held him there until the police showed up and arrested the guy. The aftermath is blurry. I was young and terrified, and I remember being physically sick for a while after that, even not returning to school until after the funeral. This thread has really made me count my blessings, I think. I'm extremely fortunate to live in an area where gun violence is quite rare, knock on wood, and murders themselves in general don't happen too often from what I can tell. That being said, stories like this really make you appreciate life you have, I think. At least they do for me. This was definitely one of the heavier threads. So, as always, I like to encourage you to take some time for yourself. Do something you enjoy, hang out, eat some good food, whatever. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.